everyone, this is Jerry. Welcome to my channel today. I hope everyone is doing fantastic. Today I wanted to share 3 cards that I made using the new Simon Says stamp card kit for June. Love this kit. As soon as I got it, I was super excited to create some things with it. I had 3 cards in mind right off the top of my head that I needed to make for some friends. So let's get started. The first card is a graduation card that I want to create for a young lady using that stencil that you just saw in this sentiment right here from the stamp set. I wanted to try and make a slimline card. Now my slimline card, I ended up just cutting it down to fit the size that I needed, and the size of my slimline card was 8.5 by 4. Those dimensions are the finished card dimensions. The paper that you see here is just a little bit bigger because I knew that I would want to trim it down once I got my inking done. The first thing I did was I pulled some washi tape out of my stash and I taped the card base itself down, or the card front itself down, and I also taped my stencil down to my work surface and to that card front. The main reason I really taped all the way around this card stencil was I just tried to make sure that I didn't get any ink off of the edge of that stencil and onto my card front. I pulled out some inks and an inking tool to start inking in the stencil. I started out with the lightest pink, which was called Rose Quartz. That is an Altenew ink. I also used some Spun Sugar by Tim Holtz. That is a little bit darker pink. I used some Shaded Lilac, which is a Tim Holtz Distress ink. And then I also used a yellow ink by Altenew called Sun Ray. Once I had those blended, I carefully removed the washi tape from my card and from the stencil. And then I used the very same blending tool sponge that I had used while creating the butterflies, and I wanted to sponge just a really light area of that same color as the butterfly, just around the butterfly, very, very lightly. I'm really using a light hand here. I'm just wanting to create sort of a glow around each of these butterflies. So I'm using the same sponge dauber that I used for each butterfly and creating that glow around each one. Next, I took a microfiber cloth that I had sprayed very lightly with just some plain water, and I cleaned up both my work surface really well and the stencil really well. And then I placed that stencil right back on top of those butterflies that I had inked. And I just used my same washi tape I had used before and placed that around the stencil and on top of the paper to secure it in place. I wanted to use some of the Gina K. It's Iridescent Glitz Glitter Gel. This is a sample size, just a small little pot of it, and I wanted to use it on my card for sure because who doesn't love glitter, right? So I used one of my craft knives I have, and I just very carefully spooned a little bit of that out of the little pot that it came in, and then just wiped it across the top of my stencil, just trying to make sure that I got an even layer on each one of these butterflies. And hopefully you can see on the camera just how beautiful this is. So sparkly, so beautiful. So once I get this spread on here the way I like it, then I very carefully remove the tape and the stencil from my work, and then I'm going to set this card front aside for quite a while and let that dry while I work on my other cards. I also wanted to mention that I discarded the leftover gel paste that was on my craft knife, and I cleaned both the stencil and that craft knife right away to make sure that nothing got left on those and got stuck to them. While that's drying, I'm going to start on my next 2 birthday cards. These 2 cards are pretty much identical. There's just a very slight difference between the 2, as you might have noticed in the picture at the beginning of this video. Both of these cards will be made for friends of mine who have birthdays coming up. And so I used the sentiment from the stamp set that says beautiful friend. I pulled that sentiment out of the kit, and I also pulled some of the butterflies so that I could try and get them sort of lined up on my paper and looking the way I wanted the card to look. Once I decide how I want the items placed on my card, I go ahead and ink those up and stamp them just the exact same way on both of my card bases. That is the wonderful thing about using a MISTI, is that you can create multiple cards using the same stamp layout very, very easily. You'll notice that my butterfly is off of the edge there, so I don't have my card just right up in that corner. I don't have the creative corners. I wish I did, and that is on my wish list because I think I would use them quite a bit. I just made note of where my paper was lined up using the ruler that is at the bottom of my MISTI so that I could get those lined up exactly the same for both of my cards. I inked up these stamps with some Gina K. This is some of her amalgam ink. It is in Obsidian Black. And I wanted to emboss this with some clear embossing powder. I'm going to be coloring these images with Copics. And as far as I have my experience, I've never had any issues coloring over embossing powder as long as I use clear embossing powder. I know you cannot color with your Copic markers over a colored embossing powder. It will ruin your work and your tips. But I have not had any problems with the clear. So I get these inked up, put some clear embossing powder on, and melt that down with my heat tool. And then I repeat this process on another card front that I've cut out of some Neenah 80-pound Solar White cardstock. And I ink up my stamps once again and just stamp it the exact same way that I stamped my first card. I wanted to mention too that both the Gina K amalgam ink and the Neenah 80-pound Solar White cardstock, they're both really great to use with your Copic markers. Right, next I wanted to start coloring this with my Copics, and I wanted to show a little bit of my process that I use. I don't know if I want to call it creative process, but it is a process nonetheless. And I really, on this particular card, I wanted to use this pattern paper because I loved the colors of it. And I thought that the friend that this card was going to would love the colors of it as well. So what I did was I took the paper from the kit and I just put it next to my Copic chart and just pulled out some markers and tried to match up the colors to the colors in the paper. That's really all I did. And also the chart that I am using, it is a chart that Sandy Allnock created, and I can put a link below so that you know where that's at. I personally prefer Sandy's chart to the Copic chart, and I will, like I said, I'll link that below, and you could also check out her YouTube channel. She is an amazing artist, and I love to see everything that she creates. So the colors for the largest butterfly are R05, that's my darkest color, R22, that is my mid-tone, and R02. I started out with the R05 and went around the top left-hand wing, basically placing that darkest color on the top and the bottom of each section. I used the R22, which is the mid-tone, and just flicked that darker color a little bit farther out into the wing. And then I used my highlight color, the R02, to fill all of that in. And then I repeated that process again, going through each color just to deepen up those colors and giving it more of a contrast. I then repeat these steps on all 4 sections of the butterfly. Next, I started coloring the smaller butterfly. For this butterfly, I only used 2 Copic markers. I used a YG21 and a Y15. I did the process twice, just like I did on the larger butterfly, but only used the 2 colors. Next, I just did some really simple coloring with a C5 marker and colored in the little butterfly bodies just to give them a little bit of color and shading. I stopped at this point for one of my cards, but for the other card, I colored in with some Copics around each of the butterflies. I ended up using an R00 to go around the reddish orange colored butterfly, and I used a Y00 to go around the yellow butterfly. I used my colorless blender and went over the edges of that area to help it sort of dissolve into the rest of the card and kind of fade away gradually, because I didn't want to color in the entire front of the card. To finish off this card, I mounted it on a piece of black cardstock, and then I placed a few black sequins on the front of the card just to give it a little extra something. I then placed this on top of my pattern paper using some Tombow adhesive. And I glued this onto my card base, which I made out of Neenah 110-pound cardstock. And I cut that down to a 4.5 by 5-inch card. Okay guys, on to my card that I started at the beginning of this video. I first took a piece of Neenah 110-pound cardstock. I folded that heavier cardstock down the middle long ways, and this will eventually be my card base for my slimline card. Then I placed the card front in my MISTI, and I pulled out that sentiment from the stamp set. The sentiment says, "Can't wait to see how far you fly." I thought this was perfect for a graduation card. I placed it in my MISTI and used some purple ink that I have. The ink is by Memento Luxe and it is called Elderberry, but I've had this ink for an extremely long time. I'm not sure it is available anymore, but if it is, I will link it below because it's a beautiful color. It is a pigment ink, so it dries slower, and that allows you to be able to do embossing with it. And you guys know I love to emboss my sentiments. It really, I feel like, makes a much nicer card. I inked up that sentiment with the ink and pulled out my clear embossing powder and sprinkled it on, and then melted that down with my heat tool. Even though my card is clean and simple in style, I still felt like it needed a little extra something. So I pulled out a jar of Nuvo drops that I had on hand, and I added 3 of those to the front of my card just to give it a little extra bling. I matted this onto a piece of lavender cardstock and then adhered it to the slimline card base that I had created earlier in the video. I really appreciate you stopping by and visiting while I create these cards. If you liked what you saw, I appreciate a thumbs up always, and click that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss out on future videos. You can also visit my blog called abushelandahug.blogspot.com, where I post all of my cards with the details and all of my other craft and card ideas. I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you so much.